So in this session, we have two presenters, and the second presentation will be by Jason Labonte from Datavant. And Jason is the Chief Strategy Officer at the company. Datavant powers the connection of healthcare data via privacy protective record linkage. Healthcare organizations use Datavant's technology to share data for analytics purposes. And Jason will talk about the COVID-19 research database, which is, I think, a very powerful data repository, if you can describe it like that, with it's a very good example of the vision that we've been discussing around making more data accessible and available. So he'll present that and the examples of its data uses thus far.
Thanks for having me. Let me share my slides here. I think Jerry did a very nice setup of what I'm going to talk about. Most of what alluded to in terms of the barriers, and hopefully you can see my screen, I think I agree with. I think a lot of the issues around data sharing and a lot of those barriers are true. What I'm going to present today is probably not the Manhattan Project version of how you stand up infrastructure and make this data available, but certainly something that can be done quickly with the many hands type of model, right? So just to give you kind of some background, we were looking at this from a US-centric approach. We were very jealous of the countries of socialized medicine when it comes to data, in that all of that data does tend to flow back to a single point for those countries, and it gives them a lot easier time kind of accessing the data, despite all the other barriers, because they like to have a central collection point. When you think about the United States, because we have this very fragmented healthcare system, when we thought about COVID data and where to find it, any patient whose travels through our health system is actually having data captured all over the place, right? There are different physicians they're referred to have different EHRs. When their tests are sent out to different labs, those are captured in different lab systems. Pharmacies are capturing it in their databases depending on where you're getting a prescription filled. Some of those get flown downstream to a claims clearinghouse and off to an insurer. And so basically, as you're looking for data around COVID patients, you actually have to go find data in all these different pots and pull it together to actually get a full view of what's going on. And so Datavant as a company, just so you understand, is approaching the data access problem using the de-identification methodology that Colette alluded to in his talk, which is that we believe one of the primary barriers to data sharing is not necessarily a lack of will, but the concerns about patient privacy and how do I share data while respecting that. And so in real brief, Datavant software de-identifies that data at the source. So, right, everywhere that a data is being collected as PHI by a covered entity, they can use Datavant software to de-identify that data. And that increases the liquidity of that data to now be shared with other partners while respecting patient privacy. As it's shared, the software also adds a linking token so that you can now join a patient's records together downstream with these other sources and get a more complete picture, all while not knowing who that patient is, right? So that's how Datavant has approached data sharing in the United States, is trying to enable this discovery of data in these different areas, the de-identification of it, and preserving the linkability. As we thought about COVID-19 early on in March, what we're seeing coming out from the research sector were two types of studies, right? There was a flurry of small real-world kind of data sets. So, a single institution would have seen 10 COVID patients and was rapidly publishing on what they had seen in terms of the natural history of it and any interventions they had tried and success or failure, right? Which is great. There was a rapid feedback studies, even if they were on very small sample sizes. The other thing we saw kicking off were clinical trials, right? And those are super robust in design. They have larger sample sizes, but they are really slow. We would have to wait 6 to 9 months before we could see results for some of those. And so Datavant and the folks that we were talking to there was really this missing layer in between, which was, how do I do rapid studies, but do them at scale, right? How do I look at a large enough sample size to trust the answers, but be able to pull that data down quickly and do those studies? And so that was what we felt was missing from our national kind of data infrastructure at the time of this pandemic hit. And so what we thought about is, if you wanted to build that middle layer, what you would really need are basically real world data sets, right, to give you that rapid scale. This data is being collected in all those different silos. And we want to pull it down in a privacy preserving manner, right? So we want to make sure that it's de-identified and protecting patient privacy. And wherever we pull it down into, this platform has to be scalable to be able to bring down as much data as we can feed it, and to kind of join those records together so that we could trace patients throughout this natural history as they visit different healthcare interaction points. And then finally, we need kind of robust governance on this data set so that a second element of protecting patient privacy is first you de-identify, but then you also control access. You don't just open it up publicly. I think that's too tempting for folks. So there's a robust governance structure that we thought would have to be put on top of that. Datavant, as I said at the beginning, we don't have data. We don't do infrastructure and analytics. We just try and solve that de-identification linking problem. And so our solution to this was actually a solution of bringing together a consortium of partners that we were talking with about the same problem. And so this is where I'm perhaps a little more optimistic than Jerry. I think there were a lot of folks who had data who were eager to make it available, but like us, were missing other parts of that puzzle, right? They didn't have a platform, they didn't have a governance structure, they didn't have a way to make that data available in a secure way to researchers. And so I think a lot of people have interest, but nobody has the complete solution. And I think what we decided was, with all the players that we know, between us, I think we actually do have all the parts of that puzzle and we can put it together ourselves. And so we've assembled this consortium with a number of different folks who are contributing data assets, so the actual raw data, the technology that goes to kind of hosting that data and making it available to researchers, and a whole bunch of services on top that provide the governance structure and ensure the privacy and pieces like that. And then we have a whole bunch of basically volunteer support staff who are helping kind of administer this entire program. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, which is how we pulled that together, what it looks like, and what has resulted so far. So essentially, the way we said this needs to work with folks, kind of aligning with that earlier slide, is we want everybody to contribute all of their materials pro bono, right? So the first thing is, once you start arguing about money, things really slow down. There was enough urgency, enough interest in making data and technology and services available that this actually was really not a barrier, which was really commendable by the different consortium partners who, this is actually, as part of their regular core business, an important way that they make money is providing these data sets and technology and services. So making it available pro bono was a really important piece here. We wanted to be able to bring in data of all types, and I'll go through that in a little more detail here. And as part of that, we really wanted to make sure that every source who was contributing data was very comfortable with who was going to be accessing it. So we built a very strong study review and acceptance process that governs which research groups are given access into the data set. And each data contributor is given a lot of control over how their data is used. And that was a really important piece of making people feel comfortable that they could protect patient privacy, they could respect their data use agreements, while still allowing researchers access to this data. So very strong privacy principles. We talked a little bit about only de-identified data is coming into the system, right? So there is no PHI that comes into the system. There will be scenarios that are allowed for limited data sets and non-HIPAA data, but in all of those, we basically are moving them into a de-identified system. Access is limited to non-commercial public health and research purposes. So again, one of the big barriers I think Jerry talked about is, people make money off of these things, and to make it freely available for research is actually scary for folks. But there is interest in doing it. And so one of the ways around that is to very clearly restrict access for certain purposes that were not going to be commercialized anyway. And I think that's a very nice middle ground that we found with all the contributors in terms of how to protect their regular business, but also make this data available for research purposes. And the final piece is kind of a corollary of that, and privacy, is that no data leaves the environment. So all this data is being contributed to a central repository. The analytics are done inside that repository, which means we can govern access into it. We can turn access off. We can see what's coming out and make sure that nothing leaves that environment that does not respect the patient privacy guidelines or the non-commercial public use kind of guideline. And so what's been great is we've actually gotten contributions of very large, very important data sets from a number of folks. And this is not easy to do. We are still in the process of onboarding some of this data because it does take a while to load some of these massive data sets and get them in the right format to be used. But we have insurance claims, both medical and pharmacy, from Change Healthcare, which is one of the very large claims clearinghouses. Symphony data is made available, a lot of their retail pharmacy data. So if you don't know Symphony, that's about 90% of the retail pharmacy claims in the United States, as well as a number of other data sets they have. Office Ally is a claims clearinghouse, which is an especially strong presence in the West Coast, which is typically a hole in some of the other data sets that are out there. So that's great to have them contributing their data. Besides claims, right, there's also data that's captured by providers in electronic health records. And Veradigm, if you don't know, is a basically data sourced from their Allscripts and Practice Fusion ambulatory EMR software systems, which is a very large swath of the United States that data is captured from. HealthJump, likewise, is a EMR data vendor. And then a recent addition is point-click care. So point-click care is actually very strong in the long-term post-acute care setting. And so especially in COVID, accessing that data and understanding what's happening to that population, where there is a much more severe set of outcomes for folks, and obviously a larger caseload, is really important. So there's a lot of kind of base medical data around COVID in these 6 data sets. But we wanted to make sure that we're kind of expanding out to the rest of the universe of data that's also available. And so we've gotten laboratory data contributions from folks who are doing, basic COVID testing, but also other tests. So there's a lot of interest in how is COVID as a pandemic and the change that it's wrought on their healthcare systems, i.e., there's a lot of care that's not happening, a lot of preventative care. How is that affecting overall patient health? Even if you don't have COVID, what are the implications for you if you have cancer or other indications? So these lab data sets are really important for understanding what are the testing volumes, what are the testing results across a wide number of conditions. Glucose is a really interesting data set. That's basically glucose monitoring that comes out of their devices and pumps that's shared by patients. And so that data, is a disease-specific data set that allows you kind of dig deeply into what are the trends you see there as they cross-correlate with the COVID pandemic. We are big believers that understanding healthcare doesn't mean you only need to look at traditional healthcare data like EMRs and claims and labs. There are estimates that up to 80% of your health status is dictated by things outside of your healthcare record. So housing security, food security, transportation, the environment, things like that. And so we are pulling in additional data sets as we can that speak to some of those factors. So we have contributions from both Analytics IQ and HealthWise, which are more of a consumer level data sets where they have taken a lot of information about you as a consumer that might traditionally be used out in the marketing world to understand you and what ads they should show you. But that data has been used to basically profile individuals in terms of their typical behaviors. HealthWise has things like your likelihood that you have pain, likelihood that you're a smoker. Analytics IQ has a whole bunch of information about what socioeconomic demographic you might be in, the type of housing you have available, your financial status. And so there's a lot of things that we think will probably correlate with outcomes in COVID or other diseases that we wanted to bring into this world. And so remember, these are all de-identified and all linkable now into that healthcare data. So even if your claims data doesn't have anything about race or ethnicity or socioeconomic status, by joining to these other data sets, you can now start to bring in those attributes and understand how does an outcome of a patient correlate to those other factors. Unfortunately, we also know that COVID has a high mortality rate. Mortality, unless you pass away in the hospital, is not something that's ever captured in a healthcare record. That is, one of the key outcomes that we often need to measure, not just in COVID, but cancer and other indications. And so we've actually brought in mortality data as well. So Munich Re is a reinsurance company for life insurance providers. And so they actually have deaths that they record as well as cause of death for those deaths from their life insurance population. And they're making that data available. And the Datavant actually curates a similar data set scraped from obituary data and Social Security death master file information that we make available. And so the idea is you can now see this large aggregation of data sets that hopefully can answer a number of important research questions around COVID. That's just the data contribution. Remember, there has to be a place for that data to go. As Jerry talked about, there's a big infrastructure need to kind of make that data accessible. And so we had to set up a number of other parts and pieces to this platform. So there has to be a place for the data to go. And Snowflake was generous enough to donate cloud hosting space for this data to land and be hosted in this central repository. Metadata is managing that entire environment. So Metadata, if you don't know, is a large clinical trial electronic data capture company who has an analytical arm called Acorn AI, and they work with a lot of real world data. And so they're using their systems and their governance structure to basically set up this analytics environment on Snowflake to provide analytical tools inside that environment. So they have tools of their own. But we also have grants from SAS and Stata to give licenses to researchers within this environment. And now that environment is now fully enabled with both data and tools for research teams. Importantly, metadata also controls all the access. So only if you are allowed access and onboarded into their system can you actually get into the data sets that you're allowed to get into. Privacy preservation is super important. And so as I spoke about earlier, each data set is de-identified, and that de-identification status has to be certified by an expert per HIPAA. And so Mirador Analytics is providing that. We have a whole privacy advisory team that is kind of looking across the entire platform and making sure that it's all set up in a privacy preserving way. But Mirador is actually doing the work of certifying the individual data sets. And when we link data, there's always the risk that you're going to add enough information back together, even if it's de-identified, to increase re-identification risk to a point that's no longer acceptable. So every time there's a linkage of two de-identified data sets, Mirador will go back in and recertify that linkage does not present a re-identification risk. So there's a lot of kind of services that go with that and make that platform come live, right? So now we have data inside a platform. It's been certified as de-identified. The last piece is a governance, right? Who can access this data? We're not just making it open to the world. It's actually a very rigorous process to get into this system. And so we have a researcher registration page that you have to register. We look at each registration to make sure that it's a valid researcher. Once you're into the system, you are brought to a knowledge base page, which explains each of those different data sets and what's in them, gives you access to a data dictionary, gives you the rules of the road in terms of what types of projects can be submitted, how patient privacy needs to be protected. And from there, you can submit a study into our scientific steering committee. So we've got a group of excellent academics led by Mark Cullen out of Stanford, who are actually reviewing your proposals. It is not Datavant nor our partners on the commercial side that are saying yay or nay. It is an independent scientific board that is approving proposals or rejecting them. And so there basically is, essentially a three-step process here where study proposals are submitted, we try to keep that to be a short submission of only a few pages. We don't want people spending 3 months writing a grant, because the entire goal here is to get a rapid set of research going. We do a quick review on that to make sure that those folks are staying compliant with the rules. We aim to turn that around in about a day. That gets assigned to Mark Cullen, who's the chair of the scientific steering committee, and he assigns that out for member reviews, much like a journal article or any other kind of academic system. And in fact, Elsevier donated use of their journal submission system for this process. So that's all electronic, and it's all running through Elsevier's tools. The scientific review committee aims to turn those approvals or rejections around inside a couple days. If they reject it, you can resubmit with modifications. And if you're accepted, you basically then get onboarded into the data. So a lot of complicated process that we set up to make sure that all those data contributors were comfortable making their data available. To go back to the barriers that Jerry asserted, right? One is money, one is privacy, and one is control. And we think with these different layers, we've solved for a lot of those. So what's our progress so far? We launched this in April, which means that's when it kind of went live with the knowledge base. We have been onboarding data and onboarding researchers since then. So it's an ongoing process. We continue to have a number of new data sets that we're trying to bring live, and new linked data sets that we're trying to bring live. So it's not done by any means. But we've had over 1,000 researchers who've already registered across 500 different organizations, which is fantastic. We've got over 100 study proposals that have been submitted for review. And of those, we've onboarded 50 or 60 of those research teams actually into the data. And so we've got a lot of projects now up and running inside 3 months, which, it was a lot of work and still will be a lot of work, but I think that's a pretty impressive result for an entirely pro bono effort that is being led mostly out of the goodness of the heart by these partners. So there is no funding, there's no cost to researchers, and that's, I think, really actually speaks well to what folks are willing to do if you can figure out how to get through some of those barriers. I'm not going to spend too much time on the results, but I did want to give you a couple examples of projects that are running, just so you can see the types of studies that people are proposing, because I think there is a very wide range, which is what you would expect to see with this kind of open effort. And we really wanted to encourage this type of variety. So you can see that there are some projects looking at just the natural history of COVID-19 and trying to understand who's getting it, what influences the severity of it, how does it compare to other respiratory diseases. And then we start to see some interesting studies around how is COVID-19 affecting other populations, right? So we talked about the diabetes lab data set. There's a lot of interesting projects around, what is the impact of COVID-19 on surgery? Here's one on prenatal and postpartum care. What happened to patients who were taking hydroxychloroquine? Was that preventative for them? We have other projects of, when people started taking hydroxychloroquine, how did that affect, lupus patients? Was there a drug shortage? Was there an issue there? We have a number of projects looking at how drug repurposing was used for COVID-19, and or what was the effect on overall prescriptions during this case. Were folks taking their prescriptions as they were before the pandemic hit, or have we seen a real drop-off in certain chronic medications, either because folks aren't able to go in and get physician visits because they are unemployed and no longer have insurance to afford that prescription? What has been the effect on kind of the larger world of prescription drugs? And then, obviously we've seen a number of paradigm shifts in healthcare around moving to telehealth, and how has that been utilized during this crisis? How has that affected overall costs in healthcare and things like that? So a number of really interesting projects that are starting to get fielded, and we get more of these every day. I'm not going to go through the results, but there are studies that are starting to pop out the other side and starting to get published. So here is a dashboard that was built by the Healthcare Cost Institute, who happens also be helping us on the governance side and administering this entire system. But they did a project looking at mortality and have built a nice dashboard on how mortality has shifted over time here. There's a group at Northwestern that we worked with who joined the mortality data with some of that demographic data to understand where are we seeing excess mortality by certain racial or ethnic segments, as well as other types of segmentations between different individuals to see who's hardest hit by the pandemic. We are also seeing some really complicated studies starting to come out. This one was done by Pietro Tibaldi at Chicago with his team, and they were looking at a framework for reopening and doing a whole lot of more economic-based modeling. But they wanted a set of predictors around hospitalizations and deaths that they used the EHR data in this database to come up with those factors. So really interesting work is starting to come out. We look forward to lots more research becoming available. And hopefully, if there are folks on the line that would also like to participate, this is the website to go register and do the project. So we definitely recommend folks do that if you have an interest.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jason. This is really just incredible. I had a few questions just came up during your presentation. The first one is this going to stay after COVID? I mean, whenever this ends, huge investments in setting this up, be very useful for the research community longer term.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So there's a couple things we wrestled with a little bit. One is it takes time for researchers to sometimes write a grant with the proposal. It takes time to get the money, and then they can start. If this goes away in 3 months, it doesn't really fit the academic research cycle. So the initial goal is to keep this up for at least a year, so that folks can not only do a project when they get grant funding, but you can come back and do longitudinal timestamp. Right? What has happened over time, so you can go back and readdress your question with more data. The data is continuously updated. The other tricky part about academic research is, and we saw this with Surgisphere, there is a strong need to verify and validate findings. And so there is the requirement to make sure data remains accessible for folks to double check, either the journal or other researchers. And so beyond a year, we need to make sure that this data still remains accessible to verify these findings that people might be publishing today. So yes, the goal right now is that this stays up at least a year. I don't think, unfortunately, we'll be out of the COVID woods by then. That was, one initial worry is this would be a big peak and go away and people would lose interest. Sadly, that's not happening. But we do want this to be kind of a resource that is live for a while.
Okay. The other thing that comes to mind is, I mean, some of these data sets are quite complex and require a lot of domain knowledge to just understand them and be able to use them. Are you also providing consulting support and help to folks who want to use the data?
Yeah, we have a couple of data scientists who are in the environment and helping folks. There is a learning curve on each of these different data sets. We provide the data layout, we provide a data dictionary. The data sources themselves are willing to provide support. It is, I think, fair that folks are going to have to play with it a little bit to get used to each different data set and what's in there. We're talking now, we have not got this set up yet, but a GitHub of sorts for researchers to share queries and code, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you come in, right? So that's not live yet, but that is something we're trying to do to make that learning process go faster.
Okay, very good. And then just one more. One of the challenges that we've seen is as folks are trying to do more computationally intensive analysis on some of these data sets, they need quite a bit of computing capacity, computing power, and some of the other platforms, I won't name any, but who are providing access to data in secure environments, they give you a basic computing capability, and then they charge for any additional computing capability. And the charges sometimes make some of these scale-ups, let's say, economically challenging. How are you dealing with the need for, especially as people start using, deep learning or more computation-intensive machine learning methods to analyze the data. How are you going to deal with the demand for additional computing capacity? Sometimes it can be quite large.
Yeah, it's a good question. To date, Snowflake has been providing all of that hosting and cloud compute for free as part of their contribution. So we have not run into a cost issue yet there. Keeping it open for a year, we may need to self-fund or continue to get some contribution to keep that going. I will say one of the tricky parts of having everything centralized and kind of locked down into this governance structure is that it's not as easy for people to bring in their own machine learning algorithms and systems and make them live in there. So for better or worse, today we're using fairly traditional tools in SAS and R and Stata and Python to do these queries, and so we have not really run into that load issue yet.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think we're out of time. So really appreciate you joining us today and giving this presentation. It's an incredible project, and I'm looking forward to the results that come out of from all this research. For everyone else on the line, thank you so much for joining us.